Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritti sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. And Chaitanya Chandra Charitamrita Shuddha Sindhu Brindavaniya Surasor Misamunimagna Jaivai Jaganni Jagunai Swayama Punanti Tan Vaishnavangscha Harinama Parannamami. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surito Pangor Mama Mandamate Guti Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sivak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Bandhan Jaha Haite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhakta Maj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Hoilo Morachita Jeva Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna upajibe priti janibe raserariti shunile borohohit Shriyatam nityam giyatam mura Chintyatam bhakta Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojan Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Maha Sagar Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu and his beloved Parshad, an exalted songbird in the inexhaustible sky of Gaura Lila Shri Krishna Das Kaviraja Gosvami Pad. Again today we'll continue our discussion of Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. We resume in the Sanatana Shiksha, Chapter 22, regarding the Abhideya Tattva, and we're here in a section which describes the adhikars, or the levels of, adhikars, but simply levels of Bhagavatas. We heard about the three adhikaris for the path of Uttama Bhakti, graded as per their Shraddha, knowledge of Shastra and hermeneutics, and their purity of heart, or Chitta Shuddhi. And now we've come to the section about three categories of Bhagavatas, or Bhaktas, graded in accord with their Rati and Prem. So as we discussed in the previous class, this gradation, as it's spoken of here in the Charitamrita, is a gradation among those who have Sadhya Bhakti, or Siddhas, and is a gradation in the relative depth of their Rati or Prema. So in the last class we discussed this verse which defines an Uttam Bhagavata in Srimad Bhagavatam in the Navayugendra Sangvad, and in particular among bhaktas who have Rati and Prem or Sadhya Bhakti, the category of bhakta that is the highest or the most advanced. So we discussed a number of different interpretations on this verse, given by Sridhara Samipad, by Jiva Gosvami Pad, by Sanatana Gosvami Pad, by Sri Chakravarti Pad. And we didn't quite finish, so we'll touch lastly on one of the points of Sanatana Gosvami and some general remarks of Chakravarti Pad, and that will conclude our discussion of the Uttam Bhagavatas, or this highest category of bhaktas with prem, and then we'll move through the rest of the gradation. So I'll pick up from where we left off in the PDF from last week, and when we finish that, then we'll come to the new file for today. So just as a brief review, I'll mention the verse under discussion, and then we'll conclude the discussion of some points from Sanatana Gosvami's commentary on this verse. So sarva bhuteshu ya pashyad bhagavad bhavamatmanaha bhutani bhagavatyatman yesha bhagavatottama. So in general, this verse is understood to mean one who can see the presence of one's own Bhagavan in all entities, and all entities within one's own Bhagavan, is an advanced Bhagavata. So, as we discussed, the word bhavam can mean presence, it can mean manifestation, it can also mean prema. And the word atmani in particular in the second half of the verse can mean one's own, or it can mean oneself, or it can mean the mind. So as per all of these different interpretations, you get a permutation of different ways the verse is read. So we left off lastly with a point of Sanatan Pad, where he read the verse as follows: one who can see the prema of one's own Bhagavan, one's Ishta Devata Sri Krishna, for all entities. And because of that, the bhava of all entities for Bhagavan, the self, is an advanced Bhagavata. So taking the word bhavam to mean prem, he interprets it to mean that not only does one see that Bhagavan has prem, that all entities have prem for Bhagavan, but one also sees that Bhagavan has prema for them. And in reciprocation, it is also seen that all entities have prema for Bhagavan. So one sees the whole animation that Bhagavan has prem for everyone and everything, and everyone and everything has prem for Bhagavan too. So, as we discussed previously, how in this world characterized by Bahirmukata, where obliviousness and aversion to Bhagavan is the most prevalent attitude, and there's a never-ending cycle of strife and suffering and war and quarrel and everything but prema for Bhagavan. How is it that these Uttam Bhagavatas see that everyone has prema for Bhagavan and Bhagavan has prema for everyone and all of this? So this is by virtue of the influence of the Chit Shakti, by virtue of the influence of Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti, coursing through their psyche and creating this impression or creating this perception of the world where one sees the world to be, quote, like oneself, or as one's own psyche is attuned, so the world appears. There's a saying in English that someone sees the world through rose-colored glasses. So in this case, one sees the world through Sarup Shakti glasses, if you will, and then sees that everyone has prem for Bhagavan, Bhagavan has prem for everyone, and so on. So how do those glasses work, or what's the prescription on those glasses, if you will? That's where we left off. Sanatan Pad gives 3 different interpretations or explanations of how this perspective comes about. So I'll just read these one more time. We discussed the first one in the last class, so I won't elaborate further on that. We'll just touch briefly on the other 2 and move on. So in regard to this interpretation, Sri Sanatan Pad offers 3 explanations as to how an advanced Bhagavata can see that all entities have bhava, that is prema for Sri Bhagavan, all of which are derived from different imports of Sri Bhagavan's being described in this verse as, quote, the self, Atmani. So the first, Bhagavan, like the self, is by nature an object of prema for the world, that is, all living beings. That is, just as the self is an object of unconditional prema for every embodied being, because it is a source of satisfaction, and satisfaction is the object of unconditional prema for every embodied being, so Bhagavan, who is the self of the self, is an object of unconditional prema for all living beings, since he is the ultimate source of the fundamental object of unconditional prema. namely satisfaction. So again, we talked about that last time. So secondly, Bhava for Bhagavan, he who is the self, that is, the causer of the consciousness in all entities, exists within all entities solely by the grace of his impelling that in them. So, in other words, the person sees Bhagavan, sees that all these entities have prem because they've all received grace from Bhagavan. That his grace is working over them, and that is impelling or driving their psyche in such a way that they are fostering and expressing prema for him. So as his own psyche is worked over, or his own psyche is influenced by the Sarup Shakti, so he sees that that grace, that Sarup Shakti of Bhagavan is working over the psyche of all other entities as well, because Bhagavan is understood to be the animating power, or the conscious power that's supplying the consciousness, if you will, or enabling all these jivas to exist as conscious entities. Although that existence is beginningless and uncreated, it's nevertheless sustained or made possible by this fundamental power, or this fundamental power source, if you will, in the form of Bhagavan. So as the consciousness of all these minute individual entities is sustained by the causer of that consciousness, or the source of that consciousness, the Supreme Self, then the fact that those conscious entities can then function in a manner or have consciousness which is conditioned by also prema for that source, for that Supreme Self Bhagavan, this is how one can also come to that perception. And number 3, Bhagavan's being the object of paramount prem for even the self, that is, any and every living being, is certainly fitting by virtue of his being the Supreme Self, on account of his being the causer of consciousness even for the self. So I kind of mixed the explanation I just gave of that second quality more or less covered this third interpretation as well. So in one sense, one can see that the prem is there because Bhagavan is the cause of the consciousness of the entity and is supplying it there, or one can see that as that cause, he's gracing them with that. In either case, it's a subtle distinction. And however one may, so to speak, come about or go about the process of inference, the main point is that they perceive all entities to have prema for Bhagavan, and Bhagavan to have prema for them. So, Sri Sanatana Pad concludes his explanation by saying that one who by virtue of personally being immersed in the rasa of paramount prema has vision of prema even in all others by means of his own inference of prema's presence in them, by any or all of the 3 aforementioned means, is an advanced Bhagavata. So, by any of these 3 means, he can infer the presence of prema in the minds of others. But why is that inference taking place? It's taking place because he himself is immersed in the rasa of this prema, or he's so steeped in this prema that his psyche is performing this inference. Now, is that an elective activity? Is that an intellectual exercise? Is that armchair philosophizing? From Sanatana Gosvami's own point, someone might be able to argue that that's the case, but if we look now at Sri Chakravarti Pad's commentary, it's clear that that's not Sanatana's intention. In other words, although he's describing this as an inference being made, when he says that this inference is being made because of being immersed in rasa, the idea is that it's not necessarily, or it's not merely an intellectual elective activity, but rather it's something that's happening automatically. So this is a point that Chakravarti Pad brings up. So let's look at these additional comments of Chakravarti Pad. He says, here in this verse, the verb, quote, can see, pashyat, only being capable of seeing so, i.e., of seeing as aforementioned, is intended, and not rather a constancy at all times of seeing so. So this is in Sanskrit a reference to what they call mood. In Sanskrit they have 10 different ways verbs are conjugated, some of which are referred to as tenses, some of which are referred to as moods. So this pashyat, what's called lot lakar, is sometimes called the optative mood or the potential mood. And in many cases, in my personal opinion, some of the subtlety and the significance of the usage of this mood of conjugation is lost in translation, because oftentimes translators don't take the care to translate this not simply in a standard tense. In other words, sometimes you'll see people translate this very verse as just an Uttam Bhagavata sees, rather than saying that the lakar actually conveys that there's the potential for them to see, or there's the option for them to see, or they have the ability to see. And those who study Harinamrita Bhakaran or Laghu Siddhanta Komadi, they know that each of these moods has a different multiple ranges of meaning that can be conveyed. So Chakravarti Pad is drawing attention here and saying that this choice of the lot lakar for the conjugation of the verb is deeply significant, because using a standard tense conjugation is problematic. So then he shows the problem. In the case of such, that is, if it were to refer to a constancy at all times, so if we just said, they see, or an Uttam Bhagavata sees, then the implication is, that's how they see all the time. So if a constancy at all times of aforementioned were intended, then a lack of pervasion, or a vyapti, that is, excessive narrowness of the definition, would occur too in regard to Narada, Vyasa, and Shuka, and so forth. That is, the definition would exclude them, since they do not see Bhagavan everywhere at absolutely all times, but rather see him only when their having a high degree of desire to see him occurs. So even these great Uttam Bhagavatas that are described in the Bhagavatam, that are the central teachers of the Bhagavatam, even that it's not that they're literally perceiving Bhagavan at every single second, but that they have the potential to see him whenever they hanker to do so. So this choice of using the potential or the optative conjugation in the verb implies that they can see him, or that they have the option or the ability to see him, but prevents the implication that they literally see him all the time. Because if you define an Uttam Bhagavata as one who literally sees him all the time, then anyone who doesn't literally see him all the time is not an Uttam Bhagavata. So if you want to start excluding Bas and Narad and Shuka from being Uttam Bhagavatas, then who's an Uttam Bhagavata? Right? Even the gopis, they don't see Krishna all day. Rather, they pine in separation from him for most of the day. So whether it's in the context of Leela, whether it's in the context of Devas and Rishis and other sages and bhaktas within Samsara, no one literally constantly sees him and nothing but him at every single second of the day. So to define an Uttam Bhagavata in that way would be too narrow. So therefore, Chakravarti Pad is highlighting this choice of the optative conjugation so that the definition is more expansive. Therefore, when longing for the sight of him increases to a very high degree, only then can one, such as Narad, Vyas, or Shuka, see the entire world to be constituted of Bhagavan. As per the principle, the lustful see the world to be full of desirable women. So this is a famous statement where it says, the wise see the world to be full of Narayan, the greedy see it to be full of wealth, and the lusty see it to be full of women. In other words, whatever is on your mind, that's what you see the world. That's what you see all around you in the world. If you're looking for money, all you see around you is opportunities to make money or things that aren't suitable as a ways to make money. If you're lusty, all you see are objects of lust or those who aren't suitable to be objects of lust. And if you're a bhakta, all you see is Bhagavan and nothing other than Bhagavan. But it doesn't mean literally you see nothing but that constantly, but that in general, your attitude and outlook is prominently characterized by that filter, if you will, or by that particular focus in regard to the field of your perception. So, he refers to another principle in exactly the same way, as per the principle, the world is seen like oneself, atmavan manyate jagat. One can see all entities in total to be verily overwhelmed with the longing of prema. So when oneself has prema and thus intense longing for Bhagavan, then there's the tendency to see that in others, just as there's a tendency to see, objects of valuables in the eyes of those who are greedy, and so on. And this principle is, used as a way of referring to conventional life, but here Cakravarti Pad is even contextualizing it in the spiritual context and saying even those who have a spiritual attitude tend to see, or there's a common tendency to see that others think, or to assume that others think as oneself does. This is to be understood, and this point we'll come back to again a little bit later. Jiva Gosvami also makes a very interesting point regarding this, which will come up in the next verse. Lastly, here in this verse, if the root drish, to see, is explained to have the meaning of knowing, jnana, then just any knower of Shastra who has knowledge of Bhagavan's being the support of all entities, who are to be supported by him, shall have the quality of being an advanced Bhagavata. So sometimes we speak of knowing something as seeing it, and that we speak of seeing the world in a way, or we talk about recognizing or knowing something, we say, I see, or I see that, is a way of saying, I get that, or I know that. So Cakravarti Pad is saying here, that type of loose equivalence between seeing and knowing doesn't apply, or is not intended. Because if all that's being said here is that an Uttam Bhagavat can see everyone to be present in Bhagavan, or everyone to have prema for Bhagavan, then philosophically, or someone with some knowledge can quote-unquote see that by understanding the principles involved as to how that is possible. So if that's the case, that anyone who has the potential or the ability to see based on their theoretical knowledge of the world, then anybody with that knowledge is an Uttam Bhagavat. But that's not the intention here. The mere knowledge of the theory or perception of the world in a theoretical way is not at all what it means to be an actual Uttam Bhagavata. So he says, therefore that is not to be explained. Meaning, such an explanation should not be given, because someone with only this knowledge is not actually fit to be accepted as an advanced Bhagavata. Since the vision described in the verse is not produced merely by knowledge, but by prema itself. So when that perception of Bhagavan, or that perception of all entities to have prema, or Bhagavan to have prema for them, is coming about because one's own psyche is completely steeped in prema by virtue of it having self-manifested into one's psyche by the grace of Bhagavan, then this advanced state of Bhagavatva is present, not just simply having the idea about it. So in that way, we can also look back and interpret Sanatana Gosvami's point about inference in light of Cakravarti Pad's point here. So, as we mentioned last time, this characteristic of how an Uttam Bhagavat has the potential to see the environment is not the only category or the only way that it's distinguished or determined that one is an advanced Bhagavata. It's one of them. And the Bhagavat speaks about that. It also speaks about others in this Navayugender Sangvad. But here in the Caitanya-caritamrta, one among the number of verses that describe the characteristics of an Uttam Bhagavat is cited as an example. So, also there's sometimes a line of interpretation, that another point that I want to make about Chakravarti Pad's emphasis here about the significance of the optative mood is that there's also some narrative out there that someone who's an Uttam Bhagavata can't be a guru, because only a guru can only teach if they perceive someone to lack knowledge. But if someone actually perceives everyone to have prem, then there's no necessity or scope for teaching anyone. There's no perceived need to do so. So it's not possible for Uttam Bhagavatas to be gurus. Only Madhyam Bhagavatas can be gurus, or, so to speak, Uttam Bhagavatas will quote-unquote descend to the mentality of a Madhyam Bhagavat to do so. So some interpretation like that is floated out there, and my 2 cents is simply that if you consider the significance of Chakravarti Pad's explanation about the optative case here, all of that maneuvering is unnecessary. And that an Uttam Bhagavat can be a guru, and in fact, Narada is the guru of Bas, and Bas is the guru of Shukadev. And it's not that they're ceasing to be an Uttam Bhagavat in the act of being a guru, but rather, just as he's saying, they have the potential to see Bhagavan anywhere at all times, and when they will so, they do so. But in the context of speaking to a student, they don't need to will to do so at that very moment, and so they don't. But there's no lack of uttamatva in them at any time, nor does it make any sense that any uttamatva could come down to a lower level of bhakti for any purpose. Why would that even be necessary? Rather, the beauty, the wondrousness of bhakti is that it itself can calibrate to whatever is required for the ultimate benefit of the world and all living entities and the satisfaction of Bhagavan in the most apt and ultimate way, rather than needing to quote-unquote reduce itself. So in that way, I just want to support that this point of Chakravarti Pad is a very nice insight. Okay, then coming now to the Madhyam. So, in the following verse, an intermediate or Madhyama Bhagavat is distinguished by means of description of certain mental characteristics they possess. So again, it's not that these characteristics are the only characteristics of a Madhyam Bhagavat, but they are some of them, and in this verse they're used as a means of identifying a Madhyam Bhagavat. So, Ishvare, so I'm coming now to the other file. I'm on verse 73, just in case anyone is not sure where I'm reading from. One who fosters prema, friendship, and grace and disregard, respectively, in relation to Ishvara, those dependent on him, the unknowing and the inimical, is an intermediate or Madhyama Bhagavata. Ishvare tadadhineshu balisheshu dvisatsucha prema maitri kripopeksha ya karuti samadhyama. Sri Sanatana Pad comments that the bhakta described in this verse is regarded as intermediate rather than advanced, because the bhakta described here has a different vision than the advanced bhakta described in the previous verse. The advanced bhakta sees the presence of Bhagavan in all, and all to be present in Bhagavan, and also sees in all the other aforesaid manners discussed in the previous commentary, by virtue of their immense prema for Bhagavan. Whereas the bhakta described in this verse lacks that degree of prema, and thus the vision that emerges because of that level of prema, such that they are not able to see Bhagavan in all entities as an advanced is. The bhakta described in this verse instead sees differently in regard to Bhagavan, that is Ishvara, his bhaktas, who are described as those dependent on him, those unknowing in regard to bhakti, and the inimical. So Jiva Gosvami elaborates on this as follows. And just as a reminder, as per the reading of this verse that we're taking at this time, in reference to Sanatana and Jiva Goswami's commentaries and the way that this is cited in the Caitanya-caritamrta, this Madhyam Bhagavata is a Prem Bhakta of the intermediate or the middle level. So Jiva Goswami explains, one fosters prema for the supreme Ishvara, meaning one is possessed of bhakti to him. One fosters friendship with his dependents, that is his bhaktas. One fosters grace towards the unknowing, that is those unaware of bhakti to him, and thus indifferent to him, as is described by Sri Prahlad in Srimad Bhagavatam 7.9.43, quote, I pity the fools, whose minds are averse to that, meaning the great nectar of the songs sung by singers of his Bhagavan's feats, and who are engrossed in bearing the burden of worldly life for the sake of the illusory pleasure produced by objects of the senses. So Prahlad is saying, I pity those people. I have compassion for those people that are toiling on in illusion, pursuing something that will never satisfy them, and whose minds are averse to the thing that actually will satisfy them. In other words, someone who's doing the opposite of what's in their best interest, I feel compassion for them. This is one such characteristic. So among bhaktas, those who do know their best interest and pursue it, one has friendship. With Bhagavan, there is prem, and with those who are unknowing, there is compassion. And finally, one fosters disregard towards those inimical towards oneself. And if people are inimical to me, then I let it go. I disregard that. Meaning, one fosters indifference by means of non-disturbance of the mind in regard to their enmity, because of the presence in one's mind of a fraction of grace even towards them, on account of their also being unknowing, just as Sri Prahlad did in regard to Hiranyakashipu. So even if people treat me badly, they're only doing so because they're also unknowing of what's really in their own best interest. So again, there's still someone who's just trying to get something good, but not knowing how to get it, and instead doing something that's only making their own situation worse, because they don't actually understand their own best interest. And I'm caught in the middle of that, such that they're treating me in a way that's causing inconvenience or trouble to me as a result of their own ignorance. But I don't need to let that spoil my day. I don't need that to wear down my mood. I don't need that to disturb my own mind. I can allow my mind to remain undisturbed by this ignorant activity. And moreover than that, I can even be compassionate to them to some extent, or a fraction of grace. Means some compassion can also be extended to them, despite the fact that they may treat oneself inimically. There's a Subhashitam which says, those who are good to the people that are good to them are common. Those who are good to the people that are bad to them are actually really good. And those who are bad to the people that are good to them are the worst. So the best type are the people that are good even to the people that are bad to them. So that point is also made here by Jiva Gosvami, saying that they may have some degree of grace even for the people inimical to them. But the verse simply describes this last category as inimical. It doesn't specify towards whom. So Jiva Gosvami makes two categories. Inimical to me, that he just discussed. But what about if they're inimical to bhaktas? What about if they're inimical to Bhagavan? Then also, do I have compassion for them, and do I not be disturbed by that, and is it not a big deal, or is it different? Therefore, Jiva Gosvami says, when they, that is inimical persons, are also inimical towards Bhagavan or bhaktas, that is, when disturbance of the mind occurs as a result of such enmity, one remains non-absorbed in that disturbance of the mind. This is the meaning. Thus, one has or experiences only a manifestation in the mind of grace towards the unknowing and of disregard towards the inimical, and not rather a manifestation of prema everywhere like the former, that is, like the advanced Bhagavatas aforementioned. Thus, the intermediacy, meaning the intermediacy of the Bhagavat possessed of a mental state described in this verse, is established. So because they don't see that everyone has prem, rather they see that some people are ignorant, they don't have prem, they're ignorant. Or that not only are they ignorant, they're also inimical to Bhagavan. They see them to be doing the opposite of prem. So therefore, their mentality, their perception is different than the advanced Bhagavatas. So the point then is that if they're inimical to oneself, one doesn't that doesn't disturb one's mind. But if they're disturbing or inimical to Bhagavan, that will disturb one's mind, or one will feel some disturbance in that, because the whole aim of a bhakta is to please Bhagavan. So if someone is doing things that are displeasing to Bhagavan, naturally there's some tension in the mind, or there's something that is disturbing to the mind, since an effect is being produced, which is the opposite of the effect that one seeks to produce. But nevertheless, he says, one remains non-absorbed in that. Or in other words, although it's disturbing, the person doesn't allow it to disturb them, or they don't fixate themselves upon that. If the person is treating oneself inimically, then the person doesn't even need to disturb their mind. They can just let it be as it is. But if they're disturbing Bhagavan, if they're disturbing bhaktas, then some disturbance is there, but nevertheless they don't let it overcome them. They don't let the mind get excessively preoccupied with it. This is the distinction Jiva Gosvami makes. So, given the distinction thus articulated between advanced and intermediate bhaktas, one may wonder whether advanced bhaktas, unlike intermediate bhaktas, relate to all living entities only in one universal manner. In other words, if they see, everyone has prem for Bhagavan, Bhagavan has prem for everyone, my Ishta Devata is present in the heart of everyone, then does that mean that they just act the exact same with everyone because they're perceiving them all in the same way? Or not? To clarify that this is not the case, and that rather advanced bhaktas may, even in the midst of their uninterrupted awareness of Bhagavan's presence in all living entities, also foster friendship towards bhaktas, grace towards the unknowing, and disregard towards the inimical, Sri Jivapad explains that advanced bhaktas do experience a special joy when they meet other bhaktas of Bhagavan, and do sustain friendships with bhaktas more so than other persons, though all the while they retain awareness of Bhagavan's presence in everyone. So it's not that Uttam Bhagavatas become so spaced out, transcendentally spaced out, so to speak, that there's no perception of any dualities or no perception of any gradations in the character, behavior, and scope for interaction that they can have with others. Rather, actually, they also may be seen to disregard certain persons, to be compassionate to certain persons, to be friendly with certain persons more so than others. And thus you might say, well, they're acting just like a Madhyam Bhagavat. So what makes someone a Madhyam Bhagavat is not simply the fact that they have friendships with certain persons or they have compassion for certain persons, but it's the underlying level of the intensity of the awareness of Bhagavan's presence, or the presence of prema, or what have you, in other entities or not, that's actually more the defining or distinguishing feature between these two levels of Bhagavatas. In other words, the more intense the prem, the more intense the absorption in the object of the prem. In the Madhyam level, it's not so intense that certain persons are perceived to be ignorant of Bhagavan, or certain persons are perceived to be inimical to Bhagavan. But in the case of Uttam Bhagavatas, the prem is so thick that it fixates the psyche so tightly upon Bhagavan, upon prema or in prema, that one can't even see others to be another way. One has to see Bhagavan present in them. One has to see the presence of prema within them. It becomes one sees the world like the self, as Cakravarti Pad said it, Atmavan Manyate Jagat. So that bhakta, because their prema is such a superlative intensity, they can't not see the object and the presence of that prema all around them. So this is a very nice point, which Jiva Gosvami elaborates on. Similarly, advanced bhaktas, such as Shukadev Goswami, also at times show a degree of enmity towards those who are inimical to Bhagavan and his bhaktas. Yet all the while their Ishta Devata remains in their awareness as the disciplinary instructor of such persons. So he says more, this is one level. So you might say, if someone sees the presence of their Ishta Devata in everyone, then how is it that they can also perceive this person to be inimical? So here he's explaining that they may even feel some enmity towards this person who's inimical to Bhagavan, but yet they see that this person has the presence of their Ishtadevata in them, but that Ishtadevata's function, due to the mentality of that person, is in the role of a corrector or a purifier or a disciplinarian of that person, because that's actually what's in the best interest of that person. So they never lose awareness of their Ishtadevata, but they see the Ishtadevata's mode or role in that place as in the role of correcting that person. So in other words, it's not that they can't perceive something untoward in their behavior, but that even though they see that untoward element, that doesn't interrupt in any way their awareness of Bhagavan's presence within them. Rather, they see Bhagavan indeed to be present, and to be present in an attuned manner to the specific behavior that that person shows. Moreover, it is with vision of the presence of Bhagavan within the inimical that advanced bhaktas like Uddhava show respect to persons like Duryodhana. So Uddhava is seen to sometimes attend royal assemblies on behalf of the Yadus, and to show and bow down to the kings of other areas, such as Duryodhana. So you might say, Duryodhana, who had so much enmity towards Krishna, who made so many offenses to so many bhaktas, how is it that Uddhava, who holds these bhaktas and Bhagavan so dear to his heart, can go and bow down to such a person? You might say, this is impossible. So, rather, it is possible, and it's described in the Bhagavad that Uddhava does so, and Jiva Gosvami notices this and explains why this is. How can Uddhava bow down to Duryodhana? So he's saying he's bowing down to Duryodhana, knowing that Bhagavan is in the heart of Duryodhana and making all arrangements for his purification and punishment. Moreover, alternately, even though they do indeed feel disturbed if they happen to observe enmity towards Bhagavan, since even particles of pollen that find their way onto Bhagavan's lotus feet are regarded by them as being required to be wiped away even with crores of their own lives. It is rare for them to actually observe instances of such enmity, because by and large a continuous manifest appearance of their own bhava being present in everyone around them, including those inimical to Bhagavan, remains in their awareness, such that they do not see others to be inimical towards Bhagavan, and rather think as follows. So Jiva Goswami is not giving a hard and fast analysis. He's saying they may, to some extent, see the inimical behavior and see the person needing correction and see the presence of Bhagavan within them as able and engaged to bring about that correction. But that's a lesser feature of their vision, and rather because their vision is so steeped in prema for Bhagavan, then their by and large tendency is just to perceive the presence of that very prema that's coursing through their psyche as being present in the minds of others. And the fact that you could not have prema becomes odd. Just as for most people in the world, if they meet, some very devout Vaishnava, they think, how is this person so spiritual? This is peculiar. How do people become like this? Just as it becomes odd that someone could have any devotion to Bhagavan for many people in this world, for these Bhagavatas, it becomes very odd that anyone doesn't have any bhakti. How could you not have prema for Bhagavan? How is it possible? So they think as follows. Now this is very lovely analysis. Jiva Goswami summarizes this, what you might call innocence, if you will, of these prem bhaktas as follows. Aho! Could there be any such conscious being who would not foster love for this supreme person or those dear to him? This supreme person in whom exists a multitude of sources of all types of bliss. This supreme person who is the unconditional and supreme object of love for all living beings. this Supreme Person who is adorned with the jewels of virtues that are delightful to all beings. This Supreme Person, the nectar of whose conduct culminates in the welfare of all. How could you not love him? How could you not think he's great? So many qualities, so much love, so much endearness, such a cause of joy. Who doesn't love him? A cause of enmity towards him, rather, is thus entirely beyond the scope of our intellects. Like, we can't imagine how you could not love him. We don't get it. We cannot imagine that it could exist. Therefore, from Brahma and so forth down to the immobile, both the virtuous and the vile are all deeply enamored with him. So, they have this phrase, return to innocence, so to speak, that, when someone becomes so purified and so steeped in the influence of Bhagavan's, the essence of the Sangvit Ladini Vrittis of Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti, then, how anything could be otherwise, one doesn't even remember. All this, how much, misunderstanding and tension and strife and quarrel and all this is going on in the world. Once you achieve that level of bhakti, you don't even remember that stuff exists. And you're like, how? What? Who? Someone doesn't love Bhagavan? How is it possible? Why not? Your mind doesn't become completely absorbed in he with all these qualities that causes all this bliss, who has such a perfect object of love. Your mind is not satisfied by that. You think other thoughts. You find it hard to remember him. We can't stop thinking about him. This is the quote new normal, if you will, of the Siddha Bhakta plane. So, okay, pardon me for getting a little excited there. In summary, I think we'll cap it for that today. I thought we might get through the Kanishta Bhakta as well, but I guess not. So the Uttam Bhagavat sees the presence of their own prem, sees the presence of Bhagavan's prem, and sees the presence of Bhagavan, specifically their Ishta Devata, everywhere. Whereas the Madhyam Bhagavat doesn't have that intensity of fixity upon prem and the object of prem, such that they do perceive some to be unknowing, some to be inimical, and some to be devoted to him, and then they reciprocate, or they behave in like reciprocation, or beneficent reciprocation with all as per whatever is appropriate. So in this way, we have two stratas of Prem Bhaktas, and we'll look at the final strata next time. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free to share.
Great class, thank you.
Cheers. All right, well then, hopefully if it's all clear, then we'll close it at that. And we'll continue next week with the rest of the analysis here. And then following this analysis of the gradation in bhaktas, then we look at all the other qualities that are found throughout bhaktas and qualities that are found in Bhagavan. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Radhe Shyam, thank you.